Welcome back to the channel. Before we begin today, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stood at the edge of a lake, looked out at the water stretching towards the horizon, and tried to imagine what it would have felt like to board a flying machine so large, so strange, so audacious in its conception, that even the people who built it were not entirely sure it would survive its first contact with the sky? That is where we are going today. And I promise you, by the time this story is over, you will understand why some dreams, even the ones that end in fire and wreckage, tell us more about human ambition than any triumph ever could. My name is your guide for today, and if you have been here before, you already know what this channel is about. We do not come here to talk about aircraft the way an engineer would. We come here to talk about what it felt like to be alive in an era when flight was still a miracle, when the idea of crossing an ocean by air was so outrageous it bordered on science fiction, and when certain men with enough vision, enough money, and enough reckless courage decided that the sky was simply a larger version of the sea, and that luxury should follow wherever human beings dared to travel. We come here to talk about elegance, about decadence, about the spaces that existed inside these machines, about the meals that were served, the views that opened up beyond the windows, and the extraordinary sensation of being suspended between two worlds at a time when most people had never left the ground in their lives. Today we are going to talk about one of the most extraordinary, most ambitious, our most visually improbable aircraft ever conceived by a human mind. It is called the Caproni Ca.60. And if you have never heard of it, do not feel embarrassed. Most people have not. That is part of what makes this story so remarkable. This was an aircraft so colossal, so unlike anything that had come before it, that when photographs of it circulated in Europe after the First World War, educated men and women looked at them and genuinely questioned whether they were real. 9 wings, a hull designed like a luxury ocean liner, passenger accommodation for 100 people. Engines lined up in rows like horses in a royal stable. A machine built not merely to fly, but to sail through the air above the Atlantic Ocean, carrying the kind of wealthy and a sophisticated clientele who had grown accustomed to crossing that same ocean in first-class staterooms aboard the greatest ships in the world. A machine built to make the impossible feel inevitable. It flew once, and then it was gone. But before we get to the end of this story, I want you to understand the beginning, because the beginning is where the real dream lives, and the dream, even in its failure, is one of the most beautiful things aviation has ever produced. To understand the Caproni Ca.60, you need to understand the world that produced it. The year is 1919. The First World War has just ended, and Europe is picking itself up from the wreckage of 4 years of industrialized slaughter on a scale that no civilization had ever witnessed. Millions of men are dead. Cities are shattered. Economies are broken. And yet, paradoxically, the war has produced something extraordinary alongside all its horror. It has produced an entire generation of engineers, designers, and visionaries who have spent 4 years doing nothing but figuring out how to make machines fly faster, higher, farther, and more reliably than anyone had ever imagined possible in 1914. The war has compressed decades of technological development into a handful of years. And now those engineers are looking around at a world desperate for hope, desperate for progress, desperate for some signal that humanity is still capable of creation rather than destruction. And they are asking themselves a very simple question. What do we do with all of this knowledge now that the killing is over? The answer, for the most ambitious of them, is to build something so extraordinary that it would announce to the world that a new age had arrived. Not an age of war, but an age of movement, of connection, of civilizations brought closer together by the miracle of powered flight. The Atlantic Ocean had long been the great barrier between the old world and the new. Ships crossed it in 5 or 6 days if conditions were favorable. First-class passengers on the great ocean liners lived in extraordinary comfort during those crossings, surrounded by gilded dining rooms, smoking lounges paneled in dark mahogany, promenades where the air tasted of salt and the horizon curved gently at the edges, libraries stocked with the literature of 2 continents, and the quiet, unhurried rhythm of days measured not by appointments but by the movement of the sun across the water. It was, would be, for those who could afford it, one of the great luxurious experiences of the modern world. But it took 5 days, and in 1919 there were men who believed it did not have to take 5 days. There were men who believed that the Atlantic could be crossed in a matter of hours, not in a tiny, roaring, oil-smelling military biplane that shook your teeth loose and froze your hands inside their gloves, but in something worthy of the passengers who would board it, something that combined the miracle of flight with the elegance and comfort of the great ocean liners, something that would make a wealthy New York banker or a Milanese industrialist or a Buenos Aires landowner feel not that they were being hurled through the sky in a machine held together by wire and optimism, but that they were floating, gently and magnificently, above the clouds, or waited upon by stewards, surrounded by polished wood and upholstered leather, with a glass of something excellent in their hand, and the Atlantic glittering 4,000 feet below them. This was the vision, and the man who decided to make it real was Count Giovanni Battista Caproni di Taliedo. Gianni Caproni, as he was known to those who worked for him, was not a man who thought in small dimensions. He had been building large aircraft since before the war, and during the conflict he had produced some of the most impressive heavy bombers that any nation had deployed. His Caproni Ca.3 and its successors were enormous machines by the standards of the time, multi-engine behemoths that rumbled through the skies over enemy territory, carrying bomb loads that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. He understood scale, but he understood what it meant to ask an aircraft to do things that everyone around you insisted were impossible. And after the armistice, when the world began to dream again, Caproni's dreams were simply larger than everyone else's. He called his vision the Transaereo. The word itself tells you everything you need to know about his ambitions. Not an aeroplane, a Transaero, something that would do for the sky what the great ocean liners had done for the sea. A vessel of the air, designed from the very beginning, not for speed or military utility, but for range, for capacity, and for the kind of passenger experience that would make transatlantic air travel not just possible, but genuinely desirable for the wealthy, sophisticated traveler who had other options and would only choose to fly if flying offered something that sailing could not. The aircraft he designed to embody this vision was the Ca.60, and when the drawings were completed and the construction began on the shores of Lake Maggiore in northern Italy, the people who saw those drawings did what people always do when confronted with a vision that exceeds the boundaries of everything they have been taught to consider possible. Some of them laughed, some of them shook their heads in quiet disbelief, and a very few of them, the ones with enough imagination and enough courage, felt the particular kind of excitement that comes from standing at the edge of something genuinely new, something that might change the world. Can you imagine what it must have looked like, taking shape on that Italian lakeside? Lake Maggiore is one of the most beautiful places in northern Italy, a long, deep glacial lake, bordered by mountains on 3 sides and opening towards the south into the gentle landscape of the Lombard Plain. The light there in the early morning is extraordinary, soft and golden, the kind of light that painters have been chasing for centuries. And in the winter and spring of 1920 and into 1921, anyone who walked along the shore near the town of Sesto Calenda might have stopped, rubbed their eyes, and wondered whether they were dreaming. Because rising from the water and the construction sheds along the bank was something that had no precedent in the history of aviation. Something that looked, from a distance, less like an aircraft and more like a small, floating city. The Ca.60 was built around a central hull, a boat-like fuselage that sat on the water and was designed to carry passengers in something approaching the style and comfort of a first-class ocean liner cabin. This hull was enormous, roughly 23 meters long, wide enough to accommodate a proper interior with standing room and circulation space, designed with large windows along its flanks so that passengers could look out at the world passing below them. Above and around this central hull, Caproni's engineers had constructed a framework of extraordinary complexity, a triplane arrangement, 3 sets of wings stacked one above the other, repeated not once but 3 times along the length of the aircraft. 3 triplane clusters, each with 3 wings, giving a total of 9 wings. 9. The number alone is staggering. To stand on the shore of Lake Maggiore and look at this machine was to look at something that seemed to belong to a different kind of physics, a different set of rules about what was and was not possible in 3-dimensional space. 8 engines drove this colossus. They were arranged in the gaps between the wing clusters, some pulling, some pushing, a configuration that the engineers had calculated would distribute thrust evenly across the enormous airframe and give the pilots enough power to lift something that weighed, when fully loaded, approximately 26,000 kilograms off the surface of the water. To put that in perspective for a moment, the heaviest aircraft that had flown before this point weighed perhaps a third of that. The Ca-60 was not just a large aircraft. It was a different category of machine entirely. It was an attempt to create, in a single extraordinary leap, an aircraft that was as large relative to its contemporaries as the great ocean liners had been relative to the sailing ships they replaced. An aircraft that was not an iteration on what had come before, but a fundamental reimagining of what aviation could be and do and mean. The passenger accommodation, as it was planned, was designed to carry 100 people. 100. In 1921, there was no aircraft anywhere in the world that could carry 100 passengers. The largest commercial operations of the era were carrying perhaps a handful of people, sometimes in barely converted military aircraft, sometimes in conditions that would have made a reasonable person question their own sanity. The idea of 100 passengers seated in genuine comfort, with space to move around, with windows to look through, with the kind of service and surroundings that a wealthy traveler would expect, was so far beyond the existing state of the art that it functions, in retrospect, less like an engineering project and more like an act of pure imagination made solid. This is where one begins to understand that what Caproni was attempting was not just a technical achievement, it was a cultural statement. He was saying, with every rivet and every spar and every carefully calculated stress load, that the sky was not a place for adventurers alone, that the sky was the next great thoroughfare of civilization, that within a generation, the kind of people who crossed the Atlantic on the Mauretania or the Aquitania would cross it instead by air, and they would do so in conditions that honored their expectations of comfort and elegance and proper service. He was not building a prototype. He was building a promise. Now close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine what it would have been like to board this machine. It is 1921, and you are a person of means. Perhaps you are a successful industrialist from Milan, accustomed to the finer things. Perhaps you are an Argentine rancher who made a fortune in beef and crossed the Atlantic regularly to conduct business in Europe. Perhaps you are simply one of those fortunate souls of the early 20th century who had the money and the curiosity to experience everything new and extraordinary that the world was producing. You have heard about the Transaereo. You have perhaps seen photographs of it in the illustrated magazines, and those extraordinary pictures that made even the most measured reader pause and look again. And now you are standing on a jetty at the edge of Lake Maggiore on a clear morning in March, and the machine is there in front of you, resting on the water, and it is even larger than you imagined. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer vertical scale of it. Those 9 wings stack upward, one above the other, at each of the 3 positions along the hull, and the whole structure rises into the morning sky with an almost architectural authority, like a building that someone has decided should also be capable of flight. The white fabric of the wing surfaces, still relatively clean and new in the early months of testing, catches the alpine light from the mountains to the north and seems almost to glow. The engines, 8 of them, armed, are visible in the spaces between the wings, large and purposeful, their cylinders gleaming with oil. The hull beneath it all, the part where you will actually sit, is lower, closer to the water, built like the hull of a small ship with its windows lined along the side, and there is something reassuringly solid about it, something that suggests the crossing of waters and the steady progress of long voyages. A tender brings you alongside. You step from the dock into a small boat. The tender takes you the short distance across the calm water to the boarding point, and you climb aboard through an opening in the side of the hull. And this is where the experience truly begins. The interior of the Ca.60, as Caproni designed it, and as the publicity materials of the time described it, was intended to be nothing less than a flying salon. Not a cabin, not a compartment, a salon. The distinction matters enormously because it tells you everything about the philosophy that had driven every design decision from the beginning. A cabin is a place where you endure a journey. A salon is a place where the journey itself becomes the experience. The great ocean liners understood this. Their designers had understood for decades that wealthy passengers would choose a ship not merely for its speed or its reliability, but for the quality of the experience it offered, and they had invested accordingly in interiors that rivaled the finest hotels in London and Paris. Caproni intended to bring that same philosophy to the sky. The passenger space was designed to be spacious enough to stand in, to move through, to circulate as one might circulate in the drawing room of a country house or the smoking lounge of a great liner. The windows, those large rectangular openings in the sides of the hull, were positioned to give passengers unobstructed views of the world outside, and the views that those windows would have offered on a transatlantic crossing are almost impossible to adequately describe to someone who has only ever experienced the sky from the cramped porthole of a modern airliner. Think of a clear morning over the North Atlantic, the ocean far below, its surface fractured into 1,000,000 points of light by the low sun, the clouds arranged below you like a second landscape, and above, the sky deepening from the pale blue of the lower atmosphere toward the profound, saturated blue that exists only at altitude, and a blue that seems to have a physical weight to it, a density, as if you could push your hand through the window and feel it pressing back. And you are sitting in a proper chair, or perhaps walking to the window to look more closely, and the light is coming through the glass at a low angle and making the whole interior warm and golden. And somewhere behind you there is the murmur of conversation and the clink of glass, and the 8 engines are producing a sound that, at this distance from them, is less a roar than a deep, steady, authoritative hum, the sound of power properly contained and directed. The most surprising thing is that this really happened, at least in imagination and in intention. The physical machine existed. The hull was built. The wings were attached. The engines were installed. The calculations were made. The dream, for a brief and extraordinary moment, was real and solid and floating on the waters of Lake Maggiore, waiting for the sky. What Caproni understood, and what the promoters of the aircraft were careful to communicate to the press and to potential investors and clients, was that the psychological experience of crossing the Atlantic was as important as the physical experience. The great fear that anyone contemplating transatlantic air travel would have to overcome was not just the rational fear of mechanical failure or bad weather, though those fears were entirely reasonable in 1921. It was the deeper, less rational fear of vulnerability, of being small in a very large sky, of having nothing beneath you for thousands of miles but cold, deep water. The ocean liners had addressed this fear through scale and solidity, and the cultivated illusion of permanence. You were not on a ship crossing the ocean. You were in a grand hotel that happened to be moving. The ocean was something you saw through the portholes of the smoking room, something picturesque and slightly remote, something that existed at a polite distance from the real business of your crossing, which was eating extremely well and talking to interesting people and sleeping in a proper bed. Caproni was trying to reproduce this psychology in the air. The Ca-60 was large enough, and its interior spacious enough, that the same illusion might be sustained. You were not in a small machine struggling against the sky. You were in a great vessel of the air, and the sky was simply the medium through which it moved. The way the ocean was the medium through which the Mauretania moved. The 8 engines were your guarantee of continued progress. The 9 wings were your assurance of stability. The careful design of the interior was your invitation to relax, to stop thinking about the mechanics of the situation, and to simply enjoy the extraordinary privilege of being where you were. Consider what else this experience would have offered had it gone as planned. Caproni and his team were not naive about the nature of very long flights. A transatlantic crossing, even by the most optimistic projections, was going to take the better part of a day, perhaps longer. That meant that the aircraft needed to offer its passengers not just seating, but something to do, something to eat and drink, somewhere to rest if they wished. The service that was envisioned for the Trans-area was, by the standards of the time, and in many ways by the standards of any time, genuinely extraordinary. Meals served at proper intervals, refreshments available throughout, an attendant or steward to see to the needs of passengers. These were not afterthoughts. They were central to the proposition. This was not transportation. This was an experience. The aircraft was as much a social space as it was a vehicle, a place where 100 sophisticated travelers from different cities and different worlds would find themselves suspended together above the Atlantic, united by the shared improbability of their situation, and would have both the space and the time to make the most of it. There is something almost impossibly romantic about this idea when you think about it carefully. 100 people, the finest of their generation, floating above the ocean in the most extraordinary machine the world had ever produced, with the whole of the Atlantic below them and the whole of either America or Europe ahead of them, with nothing to do but talk and eat and drink and look at the sky. The conversations that might have happened in that salon, the connections that might have been made, the ideas that might have been formed, and the deals that might have been struck, and the friendships that might have been begun in that extraordinary, unprecedented, impossible space. The world was smaller in 1921, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of culture and connection, and the Circa 60, had it worked as intended, would have been one of the instruments of its enlargement. Now Caproni was also a businessman, and the business case for the Trans-area was real and serious, not merely romantic. In 1921, the Atlantic crossing by ship took between 5 and 7 days, depending on the route and the vessel. The very fastest of the express liners, pushing hard in good weather on the northern route between Southampton and New York, might occasionally approach 5 days, but the average crossing for a ship departing from a southern European port, say Genoa or Marseille or Barcelona, was considerably longer. For the businessman who needed to be in New York on Monday and was sitting in his office in Milan on Thursday afternoon, this was not a trivial inconvenience. Days lost to crossing the ocean were days not spent earning money, making decisions, building relationships. The competitive advantage of being able to reduce that crossing to a matter of hours rather than days was, in commercial terms, almost incalculable. This was Caproni's pitch to the investors and the potential clients who came to see his drawings, and then, when it was far enough along, to walk around his creation on the shores of Lake Maggiore. He was not selling them an adventure, he was selling them time, and he was packaging that time in enough luxury and comfort and social prestige that the wealthy traveler would feel not just that they were saving days, but that they were spending those days in a manner worthy of their station. The Ca-60 was not just faster than a ship, it was better than a ship. It was the future, made physical and floating on an Italian lake, waiting for its moment. The testing phase began in the early weeks of 1921, and it is here that the story takes on the particular quality of a dream approaching its moment of truth. The initial trials on the water were encouraging. The massive hull moved through the water with something approaching dignity. The engines, fired up one by one and then together, produced a sound that could be heard across the lake and into the surrounding hills, a thunder that was both terrifying and magnificent, the sound of power on a scale that the residents of Sesto Calenda had never encountered before and would never encounter again. The surface tests confirmed that the basic structure was sound, that the hull was watertight and stable, that the engines were producing close to their designed output. The Ca-60 floated. It moved. It responded to its controls in the ways that the calculations had predicted it should. The people who were present for those early trials described the sight of the Ca-60 moving across the surface of Lake Maggiore as something that could stop you in your tracks. The lake in those early months of 1921 was cold and clear, the mountains to the north still capped with snow, the light sharp and brilliant in the way that it is in the Italian lakes in winter, when there is no haze, and the air is absolutely still. And across this pristine surface moved this impossible machine, this 9-winged colossus, pushing a bow wave of white water ahead of its hull and leaving a wake of foam behind it, and the engines singing their tremendous song, and the whole extraordinary apparatus looking for just a moment, not like a machine struggling with physics, but like a great creature at home in its element, preparing at last for the sky. The taxi runs on the water were followed by low-speed accelerations. The accelerations built toward the speed at which the engineers calculated the hull would lift from the water, and the aircraft would become, for the first time, truly airborne. And this is where the story reaches its most extraordinary and most painful moment. On the 2nd of March 1921, the Ca-60 made its first and only serious attempt at flight. The date is important to keep in mind because it came so early, so soon after the completion of construction, driven perhaps by the pressure of investor expectations and public attention, and the sheer momentum of ambition that had carried this project from a sketch on paper to a colossus on a lake. The aircraft accelerated across the surface of Lake Maggiore, and after a run that observers on the shore described as agonizingly long, the hull lifted from the water. It flew. For a brief, extraordinary, almost unbearably fragile moment, all 26,000 kilograms of it, all 9 wings and 8 engines, and the great promise of the Transaereo was in the air. The pilot at the controls was Federico Semprini, a man of courage and considerable skill who had been responsible for the ground and water testing, and who now found himself at the controls of the largest aircraft that had ever attempted to fly. What he felt in those moments can only be imagined. The aircraft climbed to perhaps 18 meters above the surface of the lake. 18 meters. The height of a 6-story building. The height of a reasonably tall tree. And at that height, something went wrong. Exactly what went wrong has been debated by aviation historians ever since. The most widely accepted explanation is that the aircraft pitched nose down, perhaps due to a control issue or a shift in the center of gravity, as the hull transitioned from water to air, and that the nose dipped below the horizon and the aircraft struck the water at a shallow but unforgiving angle, and broke apart. The hull, which had been so carefully designed and so lovingly built, shattered. The wings, those 9 wings that had been Caproni's statement of ambition, were destroyed. The engines were submerged. The whole extraordinary apparatus was, in a matter of seconds, wreckage on the surface of a beautiful lake in northern Italy. Federico Semprini survived, which is remarkable given the violence of the impact. He was pulled from the wreckage and treated for his injuries, which were serious but not life-threatening. The Ca-60, of course, did not survive. Now, the official story that followed in the immediate aftermath was that the aircraft had been damaged but could be repaired and rebuilt. Caproni himself, with the particular stubbornness of the truly visionary, insisted that the project was not over. Salvage operations were conducted on the wreckage. Components were recovered from the lake. There was talk, in the weeks and months that followed, of a Ca-60 Mark II, a rebuilt and improved version that would incorporate the lessons of the crash and fly again. And to Caproni's extraordinary credit, he never publicly conceded defeat. He continued to believe, or at least to profess belief, in the fundamental soundness of his vision. The Trans-Area was not dead. It was merely resting. But then the wreckage, still partially assembled and stored in a shed near the lake, while the question of its future was debated, caught fire. Whether the fire was accidental or deliberate has never been conclusively established. There are those who believe that someone, motivated perhaps by insurance considerations, or perhaps by the desire to spare Caproni the long, expensive, and potentially futile process of a rebuild, simply set the remains alight and let them burn. If so, it was a merciful act of destruction, and the kind of ending that allows a dream to remain a dream, rather than decaying slowly into embarrassment and debt. If it was accidental, then it was one of history's more convenient accidents. Either way, the fire completed what the lake had begun, and the California 60 was gone, every physical trace of it, leaving behind only photographs and drawings and the testimonies of the people who had seen it, and built it, and flown it, and mourned it. But here is what I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is where the real meaning of this story lives. The Ca-60 failed. By any straightforward measure, it was an engineering failure. It flew for perhaps a few seconds, reached a height of 18 meters, and then it fell into a lake and burned in a shed. It never carried a single paying passenger. It never crossed the Atlantic or any other body of water more significant than the width of Lake Maggiore in the few hundred meters of its brief and violent flight. It did not inaugurate the age of luxury transatlantic air travel. It did not prove that the sky could be a replacement for the sea. It did not, in any conventional sense, succeed. And yet, there is a school of thought among those who study the history of aviation, and among those who study the history of human ambition more broadly, that failure of this kind is not really failure at all. It is something more complicated and more interesting. The Ca-60 was ahead of its time by decades. The technologies that would have been required to make Caproni's vision work reliably, the engine power, the materials science, the aerodynamic understanding, the control systems, simply did not exist in 1921. The materials available to Caproni's engineers were wood and fabric and wire and early aluminum alloys, materials that worked well enough for aircraft of modest size and weight, but that were being pushed far beyond their proven limits in a machine of this scale. The aerodynamic theory of the era, impressive as it was by the standards of what had come before, was not yet sophisticated enough to model accurately the behavior of a multiplane configuration of this complexity at the speeds and weights involved. The engines available were powerful enough to get the aircraft off the water, just barely, but not powerful enough to provide the kind of redundancy and reserve that a machine of this weight demanded. What Caproni had created was not a premature failure, but a premature success. He had proved, and in those brief airborne seconds above Lake Maggiore, that something of this size and weight could, in principle, fly. That the laws of physics would not prevent a machine of these dimensions from leaving the ground. That the fundamental idea, a very large aircraft designed for passenger comfort on long-distance routes, was not insane. He had proved it with the technology of 1921, which was inadequate for the full realization of the vision, but sufficient for a proof of concept that pointed unmistakably towards the future. And the future came. It took longer than Caproni had hoped. It came in a different form than he had imagined. But it came. Within 20 years, the great flying boats of the 1930s and early 1940s, the Dornier 2X, the Boeing 314 Clipper, the Short Empire, the Sikorsky S-42, were providing exactly the kind of luxurious, comfortable, long-distance over-water air travel that Caproni had dreamed of on the shores of Lake Maggiore. Passengers on the Pan American Clippers crossed the Pacific and the Atlantic in genuine comfort, seated in proper seats, served proper meals, sleeping in proper bunks on overnight crossings. The romance of the flying boat era, which lasted from roughly the mid-1930s to the mid-1940s, and which produced some of the most extraordinary passenger experiences in aviation history, was a direct descendant, in spirit if not in engineering, of Caproni's vision. And within 50 years, the Boeing 747, the first true wide-body airliner, was carrying hundreds of passengers across oceans in a single flight, and the wealthy among them were doing so in a first-class cabin that, with its full flatbeds and its fine wines and its attentive service, would not have been entirely unrecognizable to the passenger that Caproni had imagined stepping aboard the Transaereo in 1921. The scale that Caproni had dreamed of, 100 passengers, was not achieved by any aircraft until the 1970s. He was 50 years ahead of the industry. 50 years. This is where you begin to understand the true dimensions of what Caproni was attempting. He was not just building an aircraft. He was imagining a world. And the world he imagined, a world in which crossing an ocean by air was as normal and as comfortable and as socially prestigious as crossing it by sea, was a world that actually came to exist. It just came to exist without him, and without the Circa 60, and without the 9 wings that reflected the Italian sunshine on a cold morning in 1921 before folding themselves back into the cold waters of Lake Maggiore. There is a photograph, one of the most remarkable photographs in the history of aviation, that shows the CA-60 on the surface of the lake shortly before its attempted flight. The machine fills most of the frame. The 9 wings rise above the hull in their extraordinary stacked arrangement, each cluster of 3 wings separated from the next by the structural framework and the engine installations, and the whole thing sits on the water with a kind of impossible serenity, as if it is entirely at home there, as if it knows something about what is possible that the world around it has not yet understood. The lake is calm, and the mountains are visible in the background, and the morning light is doing that thing that it does in the Italian lakes in winter, that soft, diffused, almost painterly thing that makes everything look slightly more beautiful and more significant than it might under a harder sun. When I look at that photograph, which I have looked at many times while preparing for this video, I try to imagine what it would have been like to be there on that morning, to be one of the engineers who had spent years on this project, who had given their best thinking and their hardest work to the problem of making this machine real, and who now stood on the shore of the lake and looked at what they had created. The pride they must have felt, the fear they must have felt, the particular kind of suspense that comes from being in the presence of something that has not yet been tested by the only test that matters, the test of flight, and knowing that the test is imminent. Did any of them sense, in that still winter morning, what was coming? Did any of them look at those 9 wings and feel, even for a moment, the particular chill of premonition? I hope not. I hope they stood there in the cold and felt nothing but pride and excitement and the fierce, warming certainty that they had built something that would change the world. I want to spend a moment before we reach the end of this story on the man himself. Gianni Caproni was not diminished by the failure of the CA-60. He continued to build aircraft. He continued to innovate. And he continued to dream on the large scale that had always been his natural register. His company remained one of Italy's most important aircraft manufacturers through the 1920s and 1930s. He built a museum, which still exists, dedicated to the history of flight and to the preservation of the aircraft he had created, and it stands today in the Trento area of northern Italy as a testimony to a life lived entirely in the service of aviation. He was, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary energy and conviction. the kind of man who makes the world different simply by moving through it, who leaves behind not just objects but ideas, not just machines but possibilities. He was also, it must be said, a man of his time in ways that are not entirely comfortable to contemplate today. His close relationship with the fascist government of Mussolini's Italy, which provided financial support for his work, and which he supported in return, is part of his biography that cannot and should not be ignored. History is rarely simple, and the men who produce extraordinary things are rarely entirely admirable. Caproni was a complex figure operating in a complex time, and the full measure of his life and work contains, as such measures almost always do, both light and shadow. But the CA-60 belongs to the light. The CA-60 belongs to that category of human achievement that transcends the complications of biography and politics and the limitations of its moment, the category of the pure dream. It was conceived in generosity, in the belief that the miracle of flight should be available to humanity not just as a tool of war or a demonstration of national prestige, but as a genuine enhancement of civilized life, a way of bringing people together, of making the world smaller and more connected and more interesting. It was built with everything that the best engineering minds of its era could bring to the problem. It flew for a few seconds, 18 meters above a lake in northern Italy, and then it was gone. And what it left behind was not wreckage. Not really. What it left behind was the idea that the sky was not a place of difficulty and danger, but a thoroughfare of civilization. The idea that crossing an ocean by air could and should be an experience of luxury and elegance, rather than of white-knuckled endurance. The idea that the people who built aircraft should think not just about whether their machines could fly, but about what the experience of flying in them would be like, about what the passenger would see and hear and feel and eat and drink and think, about whether the interior of an aircraft could be as thoughtfully and as beautifully designed as the interior of a great hotel or a great ship. These ideas, which seem so obvious to us today that it is hard to remember a time when they were radical and new, were made visible in the circa 60. Caproni built them. He made them physical and real and floating on a lake, and then he lost them, first to the water and then to fire, but the ideas themselves were unkillable. They had been released into the world, and the world in time acted on them. There is a question I want to leave you with as we come to the end of this journey. I asked you at the beginning whether you could imagine what it must have felt like to board a machine like this, to step through that door in the side of the hull and take your seat in the salon as the engines began to turn and the surface of the lake passed beneath you and the sky opened up ahead. But the question I want to leave you with now is slightly different. It is this. We live in a time of extraordinary air travel capability. We can cross oceans in a matter of hours in vehicles of immense sophistication. The Boeing 787 and the Airbus A350 are engineering masterpieces. The best first-class suites on the great international carriers offer beds and privacy screens and meals prepared by Michelin-starred chefs and wines chosen by masters of their craft. The technology of aviation in our era would be, to the people of 1921, as miraculous and as incomprehensible as a CA-60 would have been to a passenger on a Roman galley. And yet there is something that those 9 wings above Lake Maggiore had, something that Caproni's dream had, that it is hard to find in our own era of aviation. There was a sense of the transcendent about it, a sense that flight was not a commodity but an adventure, that getting on an aircraft was not a routine inconvenience to be endured between departure lounges and business meetings, but an act of genuine wonder, that the sky was not a space to be crossed as efficiently as possible, but a world in itself, with its own beauties and its own revelations and its own claims on the attention and the imagination of the people passing through it. The CA-60 was going to offer its 100 passengers not just a crossing, but an encounter. An encounter with the sky, with the ocean, with the extraordinary fact of their own elevation above the world that had always been their home. That encounter, in the form that Caproni imagined it, never happened. But the longing for it, the sense that travel by air should be something more than transport, something that engages the whole person and not just the schedule, has never entirely gone away. I wonder sometimes whether we have lost something, whether the democratization of air travel, and which is in almost every way a good and important thing, has come at the cost of something harder to quantify, something to do with the sense of occasion and wonder that once attended the act of flight. I wonder whether, in the determined efficiency of our airports and our boarding procedures and our overhead bin allocations, we have forgotten the vision that Caproni tried to build into the Ca.60, the vision that the sky deserves to be experienced with your full attention, that the miracle of being carried through the air above the surface of the earth is something remarkable enough to be met with a proper measure of amazement and gratitude. The Ca.60 flies still in the imagination. Somewhere over an imaginary Atlantic, on a clear morning that might have been in 1922 or 1925 or 1930, had the machine been given the time and the technology it needed, 100 passengers sit in a great floating salon above the ocean, and the sun comes through the large windows at a low angle and makes everything warm and golden, and the 8 engines sing their deep, steady song, and below them the Atlantic catches the light and fractures it into 1,000,000 bright fragments, and someone at the window raises their glass of something Italian and excellent and thinks, not for the first time on this crossing, but always with the same fresh astonishment, that this is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to them, that this is what it means to be alive in the greatest era the world has ever known, that nothing, not the finest dining room in London, not the grandest suite on the greatest liner, not any earthly luxury or comfort, can compare to this. That feeling. That is what Caproni was building. That is what was lost on the 2nd of March, 1921, on a cold lake in northern Italy. And that, perhaps, is what we are still looking for every time we press our faces against the oval window of an aircraft and watch the cities and the coasts and the oceans pass below us, still trying, in our different and more modest way, to find what Gianni Caproni was reaching for with his 9 wings and his 8 engines and his impossible, beautiful, unkillable dream. If this story moved you the way it has moved me in researching and preparing it, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me which part of this experience you would most have wanted to live through. Would it have been the boarding? Stepping through that door in the hull and taking your first look at the interior of the Transaereo? Would it have been the moment of takeoff, that long thundering run across the surface of Lake Maggiore as the hull slowly, magnificently lifted from the water? Would it have been a quiet hour in the middle of the crossing, sitting at the window with the Atlantic below you and a glass in your hand and nowhere to be except exactly where you were? I genuinely want to know. The comment section of this channel has always been one of the finest conversations in this corner of the internet, full of people who love history and aviation and the culture of a world that we can no longer quite reach, but that we can still just barely imagine. If this is your first time here, I hope you will consider staying. Every week we go back in time together to find these extraordinary moments when luxury and aviation intersected in ways that produced something genuinely unrepeatable, something that tells us not just about how people traveled, but about how they lived and what they valued and how they imagined the future. Subscribe if you would like to be here for the next journey. Share this video with someone in your life who loves history or aviation, or simply the stories of extraordinary human beings who dared to reach for something no one had ever reached for before. These stories deserve to be heard, and the people who built these machines deserve to be remembered. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you on the next journey, and wherever you are as you watch this, I hope that when you next look up at the sky, You see it the way Gianni Caproni saw it, not as a ceiling, as a beginning.